By the time my Uber pulled into my parents' driveway, the dashboard clock read 6:45 p.m., and I honestly couldn't remember the last real bed I'd slept in. 47 hours earlier, I'd been standing inside Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, arguing with a civilian cargo contractor over missing refrigeration units. Since then, I'd taken 3 military flights, 1 delayed commercial connection through Frankfurt, and a cramped regional flight into Columbus, where a guy in a Cincinnati Bengals hoodie snored directly into my shoulder for 93 straight minutes. My knees felt swollen. My lower back kept locking up every time I stood too fast, and my eyes burned from recycled airplane air and terrible airport coffee. The rain in Ohio had that cold spring smell I remembered from high school track practice: wet pavement, fresh mulch, somebody nearby burning wood even though it was almost May. I stood there for a second with my olive drab duffel hanging off my shoulder, staring at the house I grew up in. Same brick exterior, same polished brass porch light, same fake little stone goose my mother dressed for every season like it worked a part-time job. Only now there were 3 luxury SUVs parked outside instead of normal cars. My brother Cameron's black Range Rover sat crooked across the driveway, like he personally owned the zip code. My father's silver Mercedes was parked under the covered section near the garage. And there was a white Lexus SUV I didn't recognize, probably one of Lydia's country club friends who treated wine tastings like military operations. I dropped my duffel bag onto the welcome mat with a heavy thud. The ache in my knees hit immediately afterward. That deep kind of ache you don't notice until you stop moving. Rainwater soaked through the shoulders of my faded gray wool sweater while I stood near the dining room window trying to stretch my fingers back to life. Inside, the lights were warm enough to make the whole room glow gold. Crystal glasses reflected against the chandelier. Silverware clinked softly against plates, and everybody was already eating. I checked my phone out of instinct. 6:46 p.m. My flight itinerary had been sitting in the family group chat for 3 weeks. Nobody had waited. I could see my father laughing at something Cameron said while holding a glass of bourbon like he was filming a commercial for retirement planning. My mother leaned across the table fixing somebody's napkin while wearing pearls inside her own house for absolutely no reason. That part hadn't changed either. Lydia Mercer, dressed for dinner like the governor, might stop by unexpectedly. I stood there in the drizzle, watching my own family through the window like a stranger checking restaurant hours. It would have hurt less if I'd expected better. The truth was, this wasn't new. My family had always treated my military career like a long phase I refused to grow out of. When Cameron got promoted at Mercer Industrial Supply, my father rented out the ballroom at the Ashbury Country Club and hired a jazz trio from Cleveland. When I made captain 2 years earlier, my mother mailed me a text message that said, "Proud of you. Stay safe, no period, no phone call, nothing." I grabbed my duffel and opened the front door. The smell hit first: roast beef, garlic butter, expensive candles, home, apparently. Nobody noticed me immediately because Cameron was in the middle of telling some story loud enough for neighboring counties to hear. And then the guy seriously tried to counter at $900 per square foot, he said, laughing while cutting into his steak. I told him this isn't Detroit. It's Dublin. A couple people around the table laughed harder than the joke deserved. My father noticed me first. His eyes moved from my boots to the wet sweater to the duffel bag sitting near the entryway. "Well," he said finally, "look who survived." Same tone somebody uses when their dry cleaning arrives on time. Not mean enough to start a fight, just enough to remind you where you stand. "Flight got delayed in Chicago," I said. My mother stood halfway up from her chair and gave me a quick side hug without fully touching my wet sweater. "Oh, honey, you're soaked." Then she sat back down. "No, we missed you. No, how was Kuwait? Just weather observations." Cameron glanced over with a smirk. "You look like you wrestled a tractor." "I probably smell better than one," I said. That got a couple laughs, including one from a neighbor I barely recognized. Cameron's smile tightened immediately, still insecure at 34 out of quote. Incredible consistency. I took the only empty chair left at the far end of the table near the kitchen doorway. Somebody had already folded the napkin onto the plate for me ahead of time, like they were setting up seating at a wedding for a cousin nobody talks to. My roast beef had gone lukewarm. The mashed potatoes had that thin skin on top that forms after sitting too long. Nobody apologized for starting without me. Conversation rolled forward almost instantly, circling back to Cameron's newest condo investment downtown, Apparently, he'd closed on a 12-unit property near Bridge Park with huge upside potential, which was impressive, considering my father quietly funded most of his projects through the family trust. Of course, nobody mentioned that part. My father raised his bourbon glass toward Cameron. That's what happens when somebody understands real business. There it was. Not even subtle. I cut into the roast beef slowly while rain tapped against the windows behind me. My body still hadn't adjusted to the time difference. Part of my brain thought it was 3:47 in the morning. Another part was still listening for helicopter blades and radio chatter. Meanwhile, Cameron was explaining profit margins to a table full of people who'd never unloaded medical supplies under mortar warnings. Life comes at you funny sometimes. One of Lydia's friends finally looked toward me politely. "So, Evelyn," she asked, "how long were you gone this time?" 14 months. Her eyes widened a little. "Oh my goodness. Overseas the whole time, mostly Kuwait." My father took a sip of bourbon before speaking. "Well, at least she finally came home for something important." The table laughed softly. I smiled just enough to keep things moving, because if there's one thing the army teaches you fast, it's how to sit calmly in uncomfortable places without losing control of yourself. Have you ever walked into a room where your own family treated you like an outsider, while strangers respected you more than they did? And if you had the chance to prove them wrong, would you even bother? Comment below. And subscribe if you like stories about family, pride, and the quiet kind of strength people usually underestimate. I kept chewing even after the mashed potatoes had gone cold because stopping would made me look too aware of the silence around me. Not actual silence, the kind where everybody keeps talking, but none of it includes you. Rain slid down the dining room windows in crooked little lines while Cameron launched into another story about commercial tenants and market timing like he was Warren Buffett with veneers. My father sat at the head of the mahogany table leaning back in his leather chair, one arm draped casually over the side, while nodding along like every word out of Cameron's mouth deserved to be archived by the Library of Congress. "You know what the problem is with most people?" Cameron said while slicing into his steak. "They're scared to move money aggressively." My father pointed his fork at him immediately. "Exactly." I took another sip of water to hide the fact I almost laughed. 3 years earlier, Cameron had called me in a panic because he overdrafted his checking account buying bottle service in Miami. Aggressive investor. Sure, Lydia floated around the table adjusting things nobody cared about. Napkins, candles, silverware spacing. The woman treated dinner like a hostage negotiation with Martha Stewart. At one point, she quietly rotated my water glass because the logo faced outward. That pretty much summed up my role in the family, presentable from the correct angle. One of Arthur's business associates leaned toward Cameron. "So what you end up paying for the property?" 4.2, Cameron answered casually. The man whistled. "That's a serious play." Cameron nodded modestly while taking a slow sip of Cabernet like he personally built Manhattan from scratch. Nobody mentioned the part where my father transferred $640,000 from the family trust 2 weeks earlier to help with the down payment. I knew because Lydia accidentally emailed the financial summary to the entire family instead of just Cameron. She called me afterward sounding horrified. "Please don't bring that up tonight," she said, as if I was the unstable one. My father raised his bourbon glass slightly toward Cameron. "To risk." Everyone echoed the toast. "To risk." I stared down at my plate for a second because the irony almost knocked me unconscious. 3 weeks earlier, I'd spent 19 straight hours coordinating emergency fuel routes after insurgents hit a transport corridor outside Basra. 2 civilian drivers got trapped near a collapsed checkpoint while mortar warnings rolled through the comms every 11 minutes. One of my junior officers vomited behind a supply truck because he was 23 years old and convinced people were about to die because of him. Meanwhile, this table treated adjustable rate mortgages like battlefield courage. Different worlds. Arthur looked toward me suddenly. "You still planning to stay in another few years?" There it was again, not curiosity, evaluation. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin. "I signed another contract last fall." His expression flattened immediately. "Well, I suppose somebody has to work for the government." Cameron snorted into his wine. Lydia jumped in quickly before the mood shifted too hard. Evelyn always was stubborn. She smiled when she said it, but not warmly. More like she was apologizing for me preemptively. One of the neighbors tried helping. 14 months overseas sounds difficult. "It had moments," I said. That was the truth. No normal person wanted the full version over roast beef and imported candles. The woman tilted her head sympathetically. Were you scared over there? Before I could answer, Cameron cut in. Please. Evie probably spent the whole deployment sitting in air conditioning pushing paperwork. A few people chuckled politely. My father smiled into his bourbon glass. I looked at Cameron for maybe 2 seconds too long. Not angry, just tired. He always did this, ever since we were kids. When I got accepted into West Point, Cameron spent Thanksgiving telling relatives I only chose the military because nobody else would tolerate my personality. When I deployed overseas the first time, he asked whether they let women carry real guns now. He needed me smaller than him, constantly. Otherwise, he had to face the terrifying possibility that leased watches and sales commissions weren't a personality. I cut another piece of roast beef. Most military logistics happens behind desks, I said calmly. That's generally how food, fuel, and medicine keep arriving places. Cameron smirked. See, spreadsheet warfare. My father laughed louder than necessary. You know, when I was her age, I already had 30 employees. And a gambling problem, Lydia muttered quietly while fixing a serving spoon. Arthur ignored her completely. Point is, he continued, real success comes from building something people actually value. There was that word again, value. Everything in this house came with a price tag attached to human worth. Your watch mattered, your zip code mattered, your golf membership mattered. If your work couldn't be explained through quarterly earnings, my father treated it like volunteer babysitting. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let them keep talking. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the wet windows as another car passed down the street. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock ticked toward 7:30 with slow mechanical clicks. I used to hate those sounds growing up. They meant my father was home. Cameron was still talking about real estate appreciation when Lydia interrupted suddenly. Oh, did anybody see the Whitmores sold their lake house? The subject change was surgical. She did this every time conversations drifted too close to anything emotional or uncomfortable. My deployment, my father's drinking, Cameron's debt, reality in general. Lydia didn't solve tension. She redecorated around it. Arthur carved into his steak again. Good timing, too. Market's peaking. One of the guests asked me another polite question. So what exactly is your rank now? I swallowed my water before answering. Major. The table paused for maybe half a second. Then Cameron smiled. Sounds expensive for taxpayers. A few uncomfortable laughs floated around the room, and right there, sitting at the far end of that massive polished table while rain tapped, softly against the windows, I realized something that honestly should have hit me years earlier. Nobody in this house actually understood sacrifice unless there was a commission attached to it. Everything else was just decoration. The grandfather clock near the staircase clicked over to 7:31, while Cameron kept talking about leveraging opportunity zones, like he'd invented capitalism personally. I pushed my plate slightly away because my stomach had finally given up pretending it was hungry. Jet lag always hit me in weird waves. 1 minute, I felt functional. The next minute, my body felt like somebody filled my bloodstream with wet cement. Lydia noticed immediately. You barely touched dinner. I ate on the flight. That hardly counts, she said automatically, even though she hadn't asked a single question about the actual deployment. She reached over and straightened the sleeve of my sweater, absent-mindedly. Not affectionate, just adjusting appearances again. One of the neighbors across the table finally leaned closer toward me. His name was Richard, I think. Gray hair, expensive watch. The kind of guy who said things like, my guy at Merrill Lynch. He pointed lightly toward my collar. What's that gold pin mean? I glanced down instinctively. The oak leaf. Right. I'd honestly forgotten it was still attached to my jacket collar from travel. It's rank insignia. I said, I got promoted recently. To what? He asked. Major. Richard's eyebrows lifted immediately. Well, damn, he said. That sounds impressive. I smiled politely. It mostly means more paperwork. That got a few small laughs around the table. For about 3 seconds, the mood almost felt normal. Then my father scoffed loud enough to cut through the room. Not a chuckle, an actual scoff. He took a slow sip of bourbon before waving his hand dismissively through the air. Government titles, he said. Everybody's a vice president or a major or some nonsense over there. The table went quiet in that uncomfortable rich people way where nobody looks directly at the conflict because they don't want to lose access to golf invitations. I kept my expression neutral. Arthur leaned back farther in his chair. I'm sorry, he continued, But bureaucracy isn't real work. You know what happens if I screw up at my company? I lose contracts. I lose millions. Real consequences. Cameron nodded immediately like a dashboard bobblehead. Private sector pressure, he added. Different animal. I stared at the condensation sliding down my water glass, because arguing with people like this never changes anything. They already decided who you are before the conversation starts. Richard tried smoothing things over. Well, still, military service deserves respect. Arthur smiled at him patiently. Oh, I respect service. I respect discipline. But let's not pretend pushing government forms around overseas compares to building an actual business from scratch. There it was again. The reduction. Everything simplified down until it fit his worldview comfortably. My 14 months overseas became paperwork. Cameron's trust fund real estate deals became building an empire. Funny system. Lydia jumped in quickly. Arthur. But he kept going. No, seriously, he said, looking directly at me now. At some point, you have to grow up and build a real life. The room got very still. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind me while somebody shifted uncomfortably farther down the table. I could hear silverware gently touching porcelain from the kitchen, where food sat cooling under warming trays. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody ever interrupted him. My father pointed his bourbon glass loosely toward Cameron. Your brother understands legacy, assets, family growth. Meanwhile, you're what now? 37? 37, I answered calmly. Arthur nodded slowly. 37 years old, still living out some military fantasy. Cameron smirked into his wine glass. And the crazy part was, I could actually see the relief on his face. Because as long as Arthur aimed the disappointment at me, Cameron stayed safe. My father looked me dead in the eyes then. Not angry, almost worse than angry, pitying. I mean this sincerely, Evelyn, he said. You're a smart woman. But this soldier thing, he shook his head softly. It's honestly pathetic. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He continued in that same calm voice people use while discussing weather forecasts. You spent your whole adult life playing in the mud while your younger brother built something permanent. The sentence hit the table like dropped glass. Even Cameron looked slightly surprised he'd actually said it out loud. Lydia whispered sharply, Arthur, but too late. Because once certain words leave somebody's mouth, they stay in the room forever. I felt every set of eyes shift toward me, waiting for the explosion, the crying, the argument, maybe the dramatic walkout. Instead, I picked up my fork carefully and placed it beside the knife so they sat perfectly parallel on the plate. Old habit. Control the hands first, then the rest follows. I looked at my father across the centerpiece candles and expensive serving dishes, and for one weird second, I genuinely saw how small his world actually was. This man thought courage meant quarterly earnings reports. He thought leadership meant employees laughing at his jokes during Christmas parties. 3 weeks earlier, I'd watched a 19-year-old National Guard kid hold pressure on a civilian translator's leg wound for 42 straight minutes, while rockets landed less than half a mile away. That kid was brave, not this. Arthur mistook comfort for importance. Huge difference. I folded my napkin slowly onto the table. You done? Cameron asked with a grin that tried way too hard. I looked at him. Then at my father. Then around the dining room, with the polished china cabinets and framed country club photos and imported wine nobody even liked. And suddenly I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired in a completely different way. I think it's interesting, I said evenly, that the people most obsessed with legacy are usually the ones most terrified of being ordinary. Nobody spoke, not even Cameron. Arthur's expression hardened immediately. There you go, he muttered. Military attitude. I almost laughed at that. Because if he had any idea what actual military conversations sounded like at 3 a.m. during supply shortages, he'd probably faint directly into his bourbon. The room stayed locked in that suffocating silence for another few seconds until somewhere outside, headlights swept across the wet front windows again. Then came the sound of heavy tires rolling slowly to a stop in the driveway. The headlights lingered across the front windows for a second before disappearing under the covered driveway near the garage. Nobody at the table moved yet. Arthur still held his bourbon glass halfway in the air, like the conversation wasn't already, bleeding out in front of him. Cameron leaned back in his chair, pretending confidence, but his knee had started bouncing under the table. Lydia stared down at her folded napkin with the same tight smile she used whenever reality threatened the atmosphere of the room. I could feel all of them waiting for me to react. That had always been the family pattern. Arthur provokes. Cameron piles on. Then everybody watches Evelyn to see whether she becomes too emotional. Funny thing is, the army cured me of that years ago. Not because soldiers don't feel things. People who believe that usually panic first when life gets ugly. The military teaches you something different. Control matters more than emotion when everybody else is already losing theirs. I rested my hands flat beside the plate and breathed once through my nose, slowly enough nobody noticed. My fork sat perfectly parallel beside the knife. Tiny detail. But details keep people alive. That thought crossed my mind automatically, and suddenly I wasn't fully in that dining room anymore. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been inside a temporary operations center outside Ali Al Salem at 2:13 in the morning, staring at satellite images while 6 radios talked over each other nonstop. A militia attack near the Iraqi border had collapsed an evacuation corridor faster than intelligence predicted. Civilians started bottlenecking near a damaged transport route 22 miles south of Basra. Families, contractors, local translators, kids. 312 people stranded in the middle of absolute chaos. I still remembered the noise, generators, humming. Some lieutenant asking for confirmation twice because his voice kept shaking. The deafening roar of medevac helicopters landing close enough to rattle the walls. Sweat dripping down my spine, under body armor, while somebody shoved updated casualty estimates into my hands at 3:47 a.m. And through all of it, nobody cared whether I felt offended. Nobody cared about ego. You either stayed calm enough to think clearly, or people died because you couldn't. That changes you permanently. I looked across the dining table at my father cutting steak beside imported candles and polished silverware, and for the first time in years, I realized something with complete clarity. Arthur Mercer had never once made a decision where another human life depended on him getting it right. Not once. Worst case scenario in his world was losing money, embarrassment, maybe reputation. Meanwhile, I still remembered the face of a little girl wearing pink sneakers standing beside a damaged fuel truck while smoke rolled across the highway behind her. I remembered one civilian interpreter refusing evacuation until his younger brother was found. I remembered signing paperwork afterward for a 19-year-old Army specialist who lost part of his hearing because he stayed exposed too long helping load injured civilians onto helicopters. Those things stay in your head whether you want them there or not. And suddenly Cameron's condo stories felt microscopic. Arthur noticed I hadn't responded yet. "You got awfully quiet," he said. I looked back at him calmly, because the truth was I wasn't trying to win anymore. That's what changed. Growing up in this house trained me to chase approval constantly. Better grades, better discipline, better accomplishments. I spent years believing if I just achieved enough, my father would eventually look at me the way he looked at Cameron, proud, interested, certain. But sitting there 37 years old with jet lag behind my eyes, and Kuwait still stuck somewhere deep in my nervous system, I finally understood the problem. Arthur didn't respect sacrifice he couldn't measure financially, and Cameron didn't mock me because I was weak. He mocked me because he needed me beneath him. Otherwise, all that confidence fell apart. Lydia finally spoke softly. "Maybe we should change the subject." Nobody answered her. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters, while the engine near the driveway continued idling low and heavy. Whoever arrived hadn't left the vehicle yet. Arthur glanced briefly toward the front hallway before returning his attention to me. "You know," he said, quieter now, "I just think you could had a bigger life." That almost made me laugh. Bigger. I thought about the operations maps spread across folding tables at 4:26 a.m. while exhausted officers waited for my reroute approval because roads were becoming too dangerous after sunrise. I thought about calling exhausted medevac crews back into active rotation because civilians were still trapped farther south. I thought about sitting alone afterward in a metal folding chair, drinking cold coffee from a paper cup while casualty updates finally stopped coming through. Bigger than that? My father genuinely believed success meant office square footage and golf memberships. He couldn't even imagine another definition. I picked up my water glass slowly. "You ever notice," I said evenly, "how people who talk the most about leadership usually mean authority?" Arthur frowned immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means ordering people around isn't the same thing as carrying responsibility for them." Cameron scoffed. "Oh, here we go." But I kept going calmly. Real leadership gets heavy fast, especially when mistakes actually matter. The room went still again. Not dramatic stillness, worse. The kind where everybody senses there's a conversation happening underneath the actual conversation. Arthur's jaw tightened. You think I haven't carried responsibility? I think you've carried pressure, I answered. That's not always the same thing. That landed harder than I intended. Because it was true. Pressure is worrying about outcomes. Responsibility is knowing somebody else pays for your mistakes. Huge difference. Cameron rolled his eyes dramatically and reached for his wine. Jesus Christ. She talks like a recruitment commercial now. Normally, that kind of comment would have gotten under my skin years ago. Not anymore. Because somewhere between the mortar alerts, evacuation routes, and exhausted young soldiers trying not to fall apart in front of each other, I'd stopped needing approval from people protected by comfort their entire lives. My silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint they didn't understand. Then the front doorbell rang sharply through the house. Once. Clean, authoritative. And every single person at that table froze. The doorbell echoed through the house again before anybody moved. Not loud. Precise. The kind of ring that somehow sounded official even through solid oak and expensive wallpaper. Arthur glanced toward the hallway with immediate irritation written all over his face. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. Who shook up during dinner? Nobody answered. The engine outside kept idling low and heavy enough that I could actually feel a faint vibration under the hardwood floor beneath my boots. Not some teenager delivering pizza. Not Amazon either. Something larger. Cameron leaned sideways in his chair, trying to peek toward the front windows. Probably solicitors, he said. Or one of those security sales guys. The bell rang a third time. Short. Controlled. Arthur shoved his chair back harder than necessary and stood up with a sigh dramatic enough for theater tickets. If somebody's trying to sell solar panels, I swear to God. He walked out of the dining room still holding his bourbon glass while Lydia immediately adjusted the front of her blouse, like random visitors might somehow affect family reputation from 30 feet away. Classic Lydia, always prepared for social emergencies. I stayed seated quietly at the far end of the table while rain continued sliding down the windows in crooked streams. Something about the sound outside kept pulling at my attention. Engines. Multiple doors, maybe. Hard to tell through the weather. Cameron stabbed another bite of steak. You'd think people would know not to bother houses in this neighborhood. I almost smiled at that. Cameron always talked about suburban Ohio like it was Monaco. Arthur's footsteps moved heavily through the hallway toward the foyer. Then came the metallic sound of the front lock turning. A second later, the door opened with an aggressive jerk. What? Arthur snapped immediately. Silence followed. Not normal silence either. The kind where somebody unexpectedly forgets their next sentence. I looked up from the table. Even from the dining room, I could see part of the foyer through the wide archway near the staircase. Rain blew faintly through the open doorway while cold air drifted into the house. Arthur wasn't speaking anymore. That alone got my attention. My father never stopped talking voluntarily. Cameron frowned. What is it? Arthur still didn't answer. Then I heard another voice. Male. Deep. Calm. Good evening, sir. Professional tone, controlled. Familiar. Every muscle in my body tightened automatically before my brain fully caught up. Military. Not local recruiting office military either. Real command presence. The kind you recognize instantly after enough years around it. Lydia stood slowly from her chair. Oh my God, she whispered, already nervous for reasons she didn't understand yet. Cameron rolled his eyes and stood halfway. What now? Then Arthur stepped backward into the foyer like somebody physically moved him aside. And that's when I finally saw the figure standing on the porch. Tall, broad shoulders, dark green Class A Army uniform perfectly pressed despite the rain. 4 silver stars sat across his shoulders beneath the porch light while water rolled off the brim of his service cap. Behind him stood 2 silent security personnel near a black government Suburban idling at the curb with headlights cutting through the rainfall. For one strange second, my exhausted brain genuinely thought I might be hallucinating from lack of sleep. Because people like General Thomas Vance did not casually appear in suburban neighborhoods during family dinners, especially not mine. Cameron looked toward the foyer and immediately froze. What the hell? Arthur blinked rapidly. I think you may have the wrong address. General Vance removed one black leather glove calmly. No, sir, he answered. I do not. His voice carried easily through the house without ever becoming loud. That's another thing people misunderstand about authority. The strongest people rarely need volume. Arthur glanced back, toward the dining room, completely disoriented now. The man spent 40 years controlling every room he entered, and suddenly he looked like somebody who accidentally walked into the wrong courtroom. General Vance stepped inside the foyer carefully, rainwater dripping from his coat near the entry rug. One of the security men remained outside beside the Suburban, while the other stood silently near the porch steps, scanning the street with practiced calm. My mother pressed her hand against her chest. Oh my goodness. Nobody from Arthur's Country Club had ever seen a 4-star general in person before. You could practically feel the social hierarchy inside the room malfunctioning in real time. Arthur finally recovered enough to speak. "Can I help you with something?" General Vance's eyes moved across the dining room once, then landed directly on me. Instantly, not hesitation, recognition. I felt every person at the table turn toward me at the exact same moment. The general's expression softened just slightly. "There you are, Major Mercer." The room went completely still. Cameron looked back and forth between us like his brain physically couldn't organize the information correctly. Arthur frowned immediately. "Wait," he said slowly. "You know my daughter." I almost laughed at the wording, like I was somebody he misplaced temporarily. General Vance ignored the question entirely and walked farther into the house with measured, deliberate steps. The polished hardwood floor creaked softly beneath his shoes, while rain and engine noise continued humming faintly outside behind him. Nobody sat down anymore. Nobody even touched their food. The entire emotional gravity of the room had shifted so fast it felt physically disorienting. I stood automatically out of instinct the moment the general approached the dining room entrance. Years of training, doesn't matter how exhausted you are, respect becomes muscle memory. General Vance stopped a few feet away from the table and studied me for a brief moment. Not critically, almost thoughtfully. "You traveled fast," he said. "Commercial delays through Frankfurt, sir." A tiny nod. "I heard." That confused Arthur even more. "You heard?" The general finally looked toward my father calmly. "Yes," he said. "I make an effort to keep track of officers who save civilian evacuation corridors from collapsing." Nobody at that table moved. Not one person. Outside, rain hammered harder against the driveway while the government Suburban idled steadily beneath the porch lights. And for the first time all night, my family looked at me like they were seeing a stranger. Rainwater dripped quietly from General Vance's coat onto the hardwood floor, while nobody in the room seemed capable of blinking normally anymore. Arthur looked completely unprepared for the fact that the most important person who had ever entered his house was standing 3 feet from the dining room table, talking to his daughter like she actually mattered. Honestly, that part almost amused me. My father spent his whole life chasing status, bigger contracts, bigger houses, better country club memberships. He loved proximity to power almost as much as he loved hearing himself speak. And now real authority had walked directly into his foyer wearing 4 silver stars. The problem was, it hadn't come for him. Arthur cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, trying to recover control of the room. "You mentioned evacuation corridors?" General Vance didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his gloves with calm, deliberate movements while scanning the dining room once. Expensive chandelier, crystal glasses, half-finished wine, guests frozen mid-confusion. Then his eyes settled on me again. Sharp, direct, fully present. People like General Vance notice everything. That's how they survive decades inside systems where mistakes scale globally. He saw the wrinkled sweater, the exhaustion under my eyes, the untouched food, and probably the emotional temperature of the room within about 4 seconds. I stood quietly near my chair without speaking because, technically, none of this made sense yet. The Pentagon ceremony had been scheduled for next week. I'd already declined attendance through official channels before leaving Kuwait. Nobody told me he'd take that personally. Arthur stepped forward again. "Well," he said with a nervous laugh, "this is certainly unexpected." The general still ignored him, not rudely, just completely. Then he walked farther into the dining room. Every step changed the atmosphere. That sounds dramatic, but it's true. High-ranking command officers carry a certain kind of gravity that civilians almost never experience firsthand. Not intimidation exactly, more like certainty. The room adjusts around them automatically. Cameron straightened his posture unconsciously the closer the general got. Lydia looked like she forgot where to place her hands. One of the dinner guests quietly lowered his wineglass onto the table without making a sound. General Vance stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, close enough that I could see rainwater still clinging to the edge of his collar. For 1 second, neither of us spoke. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softness, respect. The real kind. The kind earned privately when nobody's filming. And right there in the middle of my parents' dining room, beside half-eaten roast beef and imported candles from some boutique store Lydia liked too much, General Thomas Vance straightened his posture fully. Years of military discipline locked into place instantly. Then he's raised his hand in a slow, precise salute directly toward me. Perfect form, sharp enough to cut glass. The room stopped breathing. Actually stopped. I heard Lydia suck in air quietly near the china cabinet. One of the neighbors physically pushed his chair backwards slightly from pure reflex. Cameron stared at the general's hand like his brain couldn't process the image correctly. Because people like my family think respect travels downward through money. They had never seen genuine honor before. My body reacted automatically before emotion even caught up. I returned the salute cleanly. Sir, General Vance lowered his hand, slowly. At ease, Major. Nobody else in the room moved. Arthur looked completely hollowed out by confusion now. I don't understand, he said finally. The general glanced toward him briefly. That's becoming apparent. The sentence landed softly, still devastating. Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it again. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. General Vance looked back toward me. You should be resting. I'm fine, sir. That's usually how exhausted officers answer that question. A couple people around the table gave nervous little laughs that died immediately afterward. The general nodded once toward my sweater. You traveled civilian? Yes, sir, commercial through Frankfurt and Chicago. And still came straight here. There was meaning inside that sentence. He understood exactly what I'd chosen tonight. Family first. Even when family barely notices. I shrugged lightly. It was my father's anniversary dinner. General Vance studied the room again after that, long enough. His eyes paused briefly on Cameron's Rolex, the untouched bourbon near Arthur's chair. The visible discomfort spread across every guest at the table. Then he looked back at me with the expression of he quietly solving a puzzle he already disliked the answer to. Cameron finally found his voice. So, what exactly happened overseas? The question sounded smaller than he intended. General Vance answered without looking at him. Major Mercer coordinated emergency extraction logistics during a hostile corridor collapse outside Basra. Silence. Cameron blinked. Arthur frowned slightly like he was trying to convert the sentence into business language. The general continued calmly. She remained operational for 31 consecutive hours while managed civilian reroutes, fuel redistribution, medevac sequencing, and regional communication failures under active threat conditions. Nobody at the table even touched their drinks now. One of Lydia's friends whispered quietly, "Oh my God." But the general wasn't performing. That's the important part. He spoke the way serious military people always speak about difficult things. Directly, without decoration. The casualty projections were significant, he continued. Major Mercer prevented them from becoming catastrophic. I looked down briefly because hearing your own actions described out loud always feels strange afterward. Especially by somebody that's senior. You never feel heroic while it's happening. Mostly tired, focused, occasionally terrified. Then suddenly everyone else calls it leadership later. Arthur shifted uncomfortably near the head of the table. Well, he muttered, I'm sure a lot of people contributed. General Vance turned toward him fully for the first time. Yes, he said evenly, they did. Then he paused. But responsibility ultimately lands somewhere, and the way he said it made the entire room understand exactly whose shoulders he meant. Mine, not Cameron's investment properties, not Arthur's supply contracts. Mine. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the neighborhood while rain hammered harder against the windows. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked at me without certainty. Thunder rolled again somewhere farther across the neighborhood while my entire dining room stayed frozen around General Vance. Nobody touched their food anymore. The candles near the centerpiece flickered slightly from cold air still drifting through the foyer, and the smell of rain mixed awkwardly with bourbon and garlic butter. I lowered my salute fully and rested my hands calmly at my sides. General Vance turned slightly then, not toward me, toward my father. And suddenly the atmosphere changed again. Because there's a major difference between a powerful man entering a room and that same man deciding to speak directly to you. Arthur straightened unconsciously. You could actually see decades of social instincts firing at once inside his head. Wealthy donor voice, business owner confidence, country club authority. None of it worked here. General Vance carried the kind of authority that doesn't care about local importance. My apologies for the intrusion, he said evenly. I understand this is a family gathering. Arthur swallowed quickly. Well, yes. The general nodded once. Unfortunately, Major Mercer declined formal recognition in Washington. That made several people at the table blink. Arthur frowned immediately. Recognition? I closed my eyes briefly for maybe half a second. Great. This was exactly why I skipped the ceremony, General Vance continued calmly. She refused attendance at a Pentagon commendation breakfast scheduled for next Thursday at 0900 hours. Cameron stared at me. You had a Pentagon ceremony? I didn't answer. Because honestly, saying it out loud always sounds ridiculous to civilians, like some movie scenes instead of real life. Arthur looked genuinely lost now. What commendation? General Vance clasped his gloves behind his back. The Distinguished Service Medal recommendation tied to Operation Lantern Ash. The name alone shifted something inside my chest immediately. Lantern Ash. Haven't heard that out loud in weeks. The operation still smelled like diesel fuel and smoke in my memory. Arthur forced a small laugh. I'm afraid military terminology's a little outside my lane. Yes, the general said quietly. That has become very clear tonight. Nobody moved after that. Not Cameron, not Lydia, not even the guests. Arthur's face changed color slightly. The general's tone never became aggressive. That's the part people misunderstand about truly dangerous authority. It doesn't need anger. Calm carries farther. He looked toward me briefly before continuing. Major Mercer coordinated emergency extraction logistics after a hostile route collapsed near Basra on April 11th at approximately 0317 local time. Every detail snapped back into my head instantly. The radios, the screaming over comms, the fuel shortage projections. General Vance spoke with clinical precision. 3 separate evacuation corridors failed simultaneously following insurgent attacks against transport infrastructure. Civilian contractors, local interpreters, and displaced families became trapped inside an increasingly unstable movement zone. Nobody at the table even blinked. Lydia slowly lowered herself into a chair, like her knees stopped working properly. The general continued. Communication systems were degraded. Air support windows narrowed due to weather conditions and rising hostile activity. Multiple officers recommended partial withdrawal to preserve remaining resources. I remembered that part clearly. One colonel wanted to abandon Corridor C entirely after sunrise projections worsened. He wasn't evil, just scared. Fear makes smart people mathematical very quickly. General Vance looked directly at Arthur. Now, your daughter overruled them. The sentence landed heavily. Arthur opened his mouth slightly, but nothing came out. The general continued in that same terrifyingly controlled voice. Major Mercer reorganized transport sequencing under active threat conditions while simultaneously rerouting fuel distribution, casualty evacuation timing, and civilian extraction priorities. Cameron blinked rapidly. That's logistics? I almost laughed despite myself. Yeah, that's logistics. People think war runs on speeches and explosions. Mostly it runs on exhausted people making impossible decisions while everybody else sleeps. General Vance nodded once toward Cameron. That is logistics. Then he added quietly, when failure means people stop breathing. The room shrank after that. You could feel it. Arthur stared at me now like he was trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of his daughter and failing badly at both. The general stepped slightly farther into the dining room. 312 civilians were successfully evacuated before hostile containment closed the final corridor. Nobody made a sound. Rain hammered steadily against the windows while the suburban engine outside continued, idling low beneath the porch lights. General Vance looked directly at my father. 300 innocent people are alive tonight because the pathetic soldier sitting at this table refused to panic while other people did. Arthur physically flinched, not dramatically. Worse. Like somebody suddenly forced him to hear himself clearly for the first time. The silence afterward felt enormous. Lydia covered her mouth slowly, with trembling fingers. One of the dinner guests looked down at his untouched wine glass like he wanted to disappear into it. Cameron stared at me completely speechless now. And honestly, that might have been the first peaceful moment of the entire evening. General Vance finally softened his tone slightly. Major Mercer declined public recognition because she requested immediate leave following redeployment. He glanced around the room once. She stated she preferred spending time with family. That hit harder than anything else, because suddenly everyone understood exactly where I chose to be tonight. Not at the Pentagon, not at some ceremony. Here, at this table, eating cold roast beef while getting called pathetic. Arthur lowered himself slowly into his chair, like gravity changed unexpectedly. His bourbon glass remained untouched near his hand. The man looked smaller somehow. Not weak, just stripped of certainty. He stared at the tablecloth for several seconds before finally speaking. You never told us any of this. I looked at him calmly. You never asked. That one almost broke the room. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. Arthur's entire identity had always depended on believing he understood value better than everyone else around him. And now a 4-star general stood inside his dining room, explaining that his daughter carried responsibility heavier than anything he'd ever imagined. All that corporate arrogance, all that smug certainty, gone, reduced to silence beside a cooling glass of bourbon. And for the first time in my life, my father looked embarrassed to be himself. The rain kept falling steadily outside, while nobody inside the dining room seemed to know what to do with themselves anymore. That was the strange part. Not the general, not the story. The silence afterward. Because once the truth enters a room, people start realizing how many conversations they built around pretending not to see things. Cameron sat motionless at the table, staring at his plate like the steak might suddenly explain his entire personality back to him. His wine glass remained untouched beside his hand now. The confidence was gone, so was the smirk. Turns out sarcasm gets a lot harder when somebody important explains reality out loud. Lydia still covered part of her mouth with trembling fingers, while her eyes kept moving between me and General Vance like she was trying to recalculate the last 20 years of motherhood in real time. Arthur looked older. That's the only way I can explain it honestly. Not physically older. Just stripped down somehow. The man who spent my entire life speaking with absolute certainty suddenly looked like somebody who realized he'd been reading the wrong map for decades. General Vance glanced toward me quietly. You should get some sleep, Major. A couple guests almost jumped hearing him speak again. Nobody had relaxed yet. I nodded once. Yes, sir. The general reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a dark navy presentation case about the size of a hardcover book. Raindrops still clung to the leather edges. He handed it toward me carefully. Since you declined Washington, I took it automatically. Heavy, formal. I already knew what sat inside without opening it. Distinguished Service Medal, official commendation papers, probably a handwritten note too. Vance always did that for officers after severe operations. Quiet morale leadership. One of the reasons people respected him so much. My father stared at the box in my hands like it might explode. You were really going to skip all this? He asked quietly. I looked at the case for a second before answering. I was tired. That was the simplest truth available. Because after enough time around death, fear, exhaustion, and responsibility, ceremonies start feeling smaller than civilians expect them to. Sometimes you just want silence, a normal bed, maybe decent coffee, maybe your family acting happy you came home alive. Funny how expectations change. General Vance adjusted one of his gloves calmly. The Pentagon wasn't thrilled with her decision, he said. For the first time all night, a tiny smile almost reached my face. That's putting it mildly, sir. One of the dinner guests finally found enough courage to speak. You coordinated all of that yourself? I shook my head immediately. No operation works like that. Hundreds of people were involved. General Vance nodded once. Correct. Then he added calmly, but leadership matters most when systems start failing. Nobody answered him. Because there wasn't really anything left to say after that. Arthur stared down at the tablecloth for several long seconds before finally speaking again. I didn't know. His voice sounded strange now, smaller, not weak exactly, human. And for a second, I saw something underneath all the arrogance I'd spent my life fighting against, fear. My father built his entire identity around measurable success because numbers felt controllable. Money made sense to him. Titles made sense, market value, contracts, tangible things. But sacrifice without profit confused him, always had. I could have punished him right there if I wanted to. That's what most people expect in stories like this. The dramatic speech, the humiliation, the emotional revenge. But standing there, holding that metal case while rain hammered softly outside, I realized something that honestly surprised me. I didn't want revenge anymore, because revenge still requires wanting something from people. Approval, regret, recognition, and suddenly, I didn't need any of it. The weight was just gone. I set the presentation case carefully beside my plate and reached for my coat hanging over the back of the chair. The gray wool still felt slightly damp from earlier. Lydia watched me immediately. "You're leaving?" "I'm exhausted, Mom." She nodded quickly like she understood now. Maybe she actually did. Maybe not completely, but more than before. I slipped my arms into the coat slowly while the room remained absolutely silent around me. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock ticked toward 8 o'clock. Cameron finally looked up. "You really never told anybody about this stuff?" I buttoned the front of my coat calmly. "You never asked either." He looked down again after that. No comeback, no sarcasm, nothing. General Vance stepped slightly aside near the dining room entrance to give me space, professional even in small things. I picked up my duffel bag near the chair and felt the familiar pull against my shoulder again. Funny how carrying weight feels easier once you decide who you're no longer carrying emotionally. Arthur stood halfway from his chair. "Evelyn." I looked at him. For years I imagined this moment differently. Him apologizing. Me finally saying all the angry things I carried through childhood. Some giant emotional reckoning where everybody cried and suddenly understood each other. Real life almost never works like that. People don't transform overnight because they got embarrassed. And honestly, that was fine, because dignity doesn't require witnesses. Arthur swallowed once. He stopped. "Tried again. I think maybe I misunderstood some things." That was probably the closest thing to vulnerability my father had ever managed in front of other people. I nodded once. "Good night, Dad. No anger. No punishment. Just truth." I turned toward General Vance afterward. "Thank you for coming all the way out here, sir." He studied me for a brief second before answering. "You earned it. Simple as that. No speeches. No performance. Just acknowledgement from somebody who actually understood the weight behind the work." The cold air hit my face the moment I stepped back into the foyer. Rain washed across the driveway beneath the porch lights, while the black government Suburban idled quietly near the curb. One of the security men opened an umbrella automatically as I stepped outside. I paused for half a second near the front door and glanced back once. My family still stood frozen around that dining room table exactly where I left them. Crystal glasses, cooling food, expensive furniture, all suddenly looking much smaller than before. Then I walked into the rain-washed night air carrying my duffel over one shoulder, finally understanding something that took me 37 years to learn. Real respect never has to beg for recognition from people determined not to see it. And for the first time in my life, I stopped walking toward their approval. I started walking toward my own direction instead. The windshield wipers dragged slowly across the glass, while I drove south on Interstate 71 with the metal case sitting unopened on the passenger seats beside me. Rain blurred the highway lights into long streaks of white and red. My GPS kept insisting I was 32 minutes from the hotel, but honestly, I barely registered the drive. My body had finally crossed into that dangerous level of exhaustion, where your brain starts functioning like somebody forgot to fully plug it in. At 10:54 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of a Hampton Inn outside Wilmington because I physically couldn't stay awake any longer. Nothing glamorous about it either. Half the parking lot lights flickered. Somebody abandoned a shopping cart near the side entrance. The vending machine inside the lobby made a grinding noise every 14 seconds, like it was dying slowly but refusing to commit. Perfect. I checked in wearing my damp sweater and carrying my army duffel while the guy behind the counter tried very hard not to stare at the 4-star challenge coin Lydia Vance had slipped into my hand before leaving my parents' house. "Long night?" he asked. I almost laughed. You have no idea. 5 minutes later, I was sitting alone on the edge of a hotel bed eating vending machine pretzels and staring at the beige wall across from me. That's the funny thing about emotionally life-changing moments. Sometimes they end in dramatic music. Sometimes they end with stale pretzels and a broken ice machine down the hall. I leaned back slowly and rubbed both hands over my face. And for the first time all night, the silence finally caught up to me. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind. Because once adrenaline disappears, honesty usually shows up right afterward. The truth was, General Vance didn't actually change my family tonight. He just exposed them. That's different. My father had always measured people through visible success. Money, position, reputation. Tangible proof he could explain to other wealthy men over bourbon. If somebody sacrificed quietly without public recognition attached to it, Arthur honestly didn't know how to value them. And my entire life, I kept trying to translate myself into a language he respected. Better grades, better discipline, bigger accomplishments, military promotions, overseas deployments. I thought eventually he'd look at me the way fathers are supposed to look at daughters when they're proud. But some people only understand worth when it benefits their worldview personally. That realization hurts longer than anger does. I grabbed one of the tiny pretzel bags from the nightstand and crushed it absent-mindedly between my fingers. 14 months overseas, 31 hours coordinating evacuation logistics without sleep, 300 civilians making it out alive. And somehow the thing that almost broke me emotionally was still sitting at a dinner table feeling unwanted inside my own family. That's how deep childhood stuff goes. People underestimate that. Especially high-functioning adults. You can become disciplined, successful, respected, financially stable, emotionally controlled, and still secretly feel 10 years old around the wrong people. I stared at the dark TV screen across the room and thought about something one of our combat medics told me in Kuwait after a rough week. Everybody has a pressure point, he said while microwaving terrible coffee at 2 a.m. Some people's just happens to be emotional. At the time, I laughed it off. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Family has access to old versions of you nobody else sees anymore. That's why emotionally unhealthy families are so confusing. They keep talking to the child you used to be while ignoring the adult standing directly in front of them. And if you're not careful, you spend your entire life trying to earn love from people who only hand out conditional approval. I know a lot of people watching this probably understand that feeling better than they want to admit. Maybe your parents only praised achievement. Maybe you became the responsible one because everybody else in the family fell apart constantly. Maybe you learned early that being useful earned more affection than being emotionally honest. That kind of thing follows people for decades, sometimes entire lifetimes. I sat quietly for a minute listening to rain hit the hotel window. Then I finally opened the metal presentation case. Dark blue velvet inside, silver lettering, official documents. The metal itself rested perfectly centered under the cheap hotel lamp beside a Bible somebody left in the drawer years ago. And honestly, I didn't feel triumphant looking at it. Just tired. Not because the recognition didn't matter. It did. But eventually you realize achievement cannot heal emotional neglect. No promotion fixes it. No paycheck fixes it. No award fixes it. Because the problem was never your value. The problem was the audience. That's the part I wish more people understood earlier in life. Stop trying to explain your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. Seriously, pay attention to who only values you when your success improves their image. Pay attention to who minimizes your sacrifices until strangers acknowledge them publicly first. And most importantly, stop confusing emotional access with emotional safety. Those are not the same thing. Some families love you while still damaging your self-worth constantly. That reality makes people uncomfortable, but it's true. I checked the hotel clock, 11:48 p.m. The room hummed quietly from old air conditioning while headlights occasionally swept across the curtains from the interstate outside. And sitting there alone with stale pretzels, jet lag, and a medal I never even planned to accept publicly, I realized something that honestly stunned me a little. I felt less lonely in that cheap hotel room than I did, sitting at my parents' dinner table. That was the moment I finally understood how much emotional energy I'd wasted chasing approval from people who had already decided not to see me clearly. And once you understand that, something inside you finally starts getting quiet. The hotel coffee tasted like somebody boiled pennies in sink water, but it was hot, and at 6:30 in the morning, that qualified as emotional support. I sat near the lobby window, wearing the same gray sweater from the night before, while rain dripped steadily off parked trucks outside. A guy in a Cincinnati Reds jacket snored softly in an armchair near the vending machines. Two nurses wearing navy scrubs walked in looking half dead from an overnight shift and immediately headed for caffeine like their lives depended on it. Honestly, I respected them instantly. You start noticing certain people differently after enough years in logistics command. The quiet ones, the exhausted ones, the people carrying responsibilities nobody applauds publicly. General Vance's words from the night before kept replaying in my head while I stirred powdered creamer into terrible coffee. Pressure is not the same thing as responsibility. That sentence landed harder on me after everything calmed down, because most people genuinely confuse those two things, especially in America. We glamorize pressure constantly: busy schedules, stress, high-paying jobs, everybody walking around acting like their inbox deserves military honors. But responsibility? That's different. Pressure usually means you're afraid something will happen to you. Responsibility means something might happen to somebody else because of you. Huge difference. My father lived under pressure his entire adult life: payroll, contracts, market shifts, competition. I'm not pretending those things are easy. Building a company takes discipline. But pressure protects ego, responsibility protects people. That changes the emotional weight completely. I watched one of the nurses pour coffee with hands that looked physically exhausted. That woman probably spent 12 hours keeping strangers alive while hospital administrators argued about budgets somewhere upstairs. Nobody was giving her a standing ovation this morning. That's real life. And honestly, those are the people I trust most now. Not the loudest people, not the richest, the reliable ones. The ones who keep functioning when situations become uncomfortable. Back in Kuwait, we had a staff sergeant named Morales who never raised his voice once in 14 months. Not one time. Didn't matter if generators failed, fuel shipments got delayed, or communication systems collapsed for 6 straight hours. Calm every single time. One night, around 1:20 a.m., we lost refrigeration support for last nickel inventory during a regional power issue. Everybody started spiraling immediately because temperature-sensitive supplies were at risk. Young officers running around sweating through uniforms. Contractors blaming each other. Radios chirping nonstop. Morales quietly grabbed a clipboard, reorganized transport priorities, and solved 80% of the issue in 20 minutes. No speech, no drama, no "look at me." That's leadership. And the crazy part is, people like him almost never become internet-famous motivational stories because calm competence isn't flashy enough anymore. Same thing with regular civilian life. The single mother waking up at 4:45 every morning to get her kids ready before working 10 hours. The construction guy whose knees are destroyed by age 48 because he spent decades building things other people take for granted. The older sister helping raise siblings while still trying to finish community college. The son taking care of aging parents quietly while everybody else in the family disappears conveniently. Those people understand responsibility, not performative stress. Real responsibility changes how you move through the world because somebody else depends on your stability emotionally, financially, or physically. And once you carry that kind of weight long enough, your definition of strength changes permanently. That's part of why my father's comments stopped affecting me the same way after a while. Not because they didn't hurt. They did. But eventually you realize some people confuse comfort with wisdom. Arthur genuinely believed success automatically created character. Big house equals important man. Expensive watch equals credibility. Stressful meetings equal sacrifice. A lot of people think like that. But pressure without responsibility often creates entitlement instead of maturity. Responsibility without recognition usually creates humility. That's why some of the strongest people I've ever met would never call themselves important. They are too busy carrying things. I took another sip of awful coffee and looked outside at the wet parking lot. A man in work boots climbed out of an old plumbing van while rubbing sleep from his eyes. Probably starting another 10-hour day before most people finish breakfast. Nobody calls that leadership, but it is. That guy's customers probably panic the second their homes flood or pipes burst. Families depend on him doing his job correctly, even if nobody praises him afterward. Society survives because ordinary people quietly stay dependable, not because influencers post productivity quotes online. I wish more people understood that earlier in life, especially younger people growing up in achievement-obsessed families. Your value is not determined by how impressive your life looks during dinner conversations. Some of the most emotionally empty people I've ever met had beautiful houses and expensive degrees. And some of the most trustworthy people I've ever known drove 20-year-old trucks and worked double shifts without complaining. Character reveals itself fastest when inconvenience shows up. That's the real test. Not image, not branding, not performance, inconvenience. I glanced toward the metal case sitting beside me on the booth seat, still unopened since last night. For a second, I thought about taking a picture and texting it to somebody from my unit. maybe posting it online, letting people celebrate it publicly. Instead, I just rested my hand on top of the case quietly. Because General Vance was right about one thing: leadership gets heavy fast. And after enough years carrying responsibility, attention starts feeling less important than peace. That might be the biggest lesson I learned from the entire night. Respect your own sacrifices even when nobody claps for them. Seriously. Because the people keeping families, hospitals, schools, military units, and entire communities functioning are usually not the loudest people in the room. They're just the ones who keep showing up when things get hard. And honestly, that matters a hell of a lot more than looking impressive over steak and bourbon. The rain finally stopped sometime around sunrise. I noticed it when the hotel room got brighter without me realizing why at first. For a few seconds, I just laid there staring at the ceiling to the air conditioner hum softly while interstate traffic rolled faintly outside. My body still felt wrecked from travel. Every joint hurt. My brain was operating on maybe 4 hours of broken sleep and airport caffeine. But emotionally, something felt different, lighter, not happy exactly, just quieter. That surprised me more than anything. Because for years, I thought peace would come after some giant emotional breakthrough. My father apologizing, my family suddenly understanding me, some dramatic healing moment where everybody finally saw each other clearly and hugged it out like the ending of a movie nobody actually watches twice. Real life almost never works like that. Most people do not transform overnight because they got embarrassed once. And honestly, waiting for people to become emotionally healthier before allowing yourself peace is a terrible way to live. That's probably the biggest lesson I took from that entire night. I sat up slowly and looked over at the metal case resting on the nightstand beside my phone and hotel keycard. Still unopened again. Funny, honestly. I spent most of my childhood believing achievement would finally make me feel accepted inside my own family. Better grades, better discipline, better performance. Then military promotions, deployments, responsibility, recognition. But emotionally unhealthy families have a strange way of trapping people inside old roles, no matter how much they grow. Somebody watching this right now probably understands exactly what I mean. Maybe you became the responsible one. Maybe your entire family treats you like the emotional cleanup crew, while everybody else gets to act reckless. Maybe you became the overachiever because praise only showed up when you accomplished something impressive. Or maybe you're still carrying the role of family disappointment, even though you've built a perfectly respectable life. Families do that sometimes. They freeze your identity emotionally while your actual life keeps moving forward. And if you're not careful, you spend decades trying to earn permission to become yourself around people who already decided who you're allowed to be. That realization hit me hard driving away from my parents' house. Not because Arthur hated me. Honestly, I don't think he did. My father loved me the only way he understood how. The problem was, his version of loves still required performance, status, and emotional convenience. And eventually, you reach an age where you have to ask yourself a difficult question. How much of your life are you willing to spend shrinking yourself just to remain emotionally acceptable to other people? That question changes everything. I got dressed slowly while morning light pushed through the curtains, jeans, boots. Same gray sweater again, because my duffel bag still smelled faintly like Kuwait and airport terminals. Then I carried my coffee outside and stood near the parking lot for a minute, watching traffic move along the interstate. Normal people heading toward normal lives. Construction crews, delivery drivers, nurses getting off overnight shifts, parents probably trying to get kids to school without losing their minds before 8 a.m. Real life. And standing there beside that cheap hotel with cold morning air hitting my face, I realized something I wish somebody taught me years earlier. Healing does not always mean repairing every relationship. Sometimes healing means accepting people honestly instead of endlessly hoping they become different. That's a painful lesson for a lot of adults, especially good-hearted people. Because emotionally mature people tend to over-explain, over-forgive, and overextend themselves trying to maintain family peace. They keep returning to environments that quietly damage them because they're still family. But family without respect slowly crushes your nervous system. People don't talk about that enough. You start second-guessing yourself constantly, minimizing your accomplishments, feeling guilty for setting boundaries, feeling emotionally drained after every interaction, while pretending everything's normal during holidays. That's not peace. That's survival. And no, I'm not saying everybody should dramatically cut their families off over one bad dinner conversation. Internet advice loves extremes. Real life is more complicated than that, but I am saying this. Pay attention to how people make you feel repeatedly. Not occasionally, repeatedly. If you constantly leave interactions feeling smaller, dismissed, mocked, or emotionally exhausted, that matters. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is quietly stop fighting for validation. Inside rooms that require you to betray yourself just to stay accepted. No screaming, no revenge speech, no social media announcement, just boundaries, quiet ones, adult ones. The kind where you stop volunteering for emotional disrespect. I loaded my duffel into the trunk of the rental car around 7:12 a.m. while cold wind moved across the parking lot. The sky had finally cleared enough for sunlight to break through the clouds in thin streaks over the highway. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was driving away from something emotionally unfinished. That part was over. Not because my father magically changed overnight. Not because my family suddenly understood everything. But because I finally stopped making my worth dependent on whether they understood it. That's freedom. Real freedom. And if there's one thing I hope people take from this story, it's this. Some people will never fully understand your sacrifices. Some rooms will never clap for you. Some families will only value the version of you they can control comfortably. Build your life anyway. Protect your peace anyway. Keep moving forward anyway. Because eventually you realize the goal was never proving people wrong. The goal was learning how to belong to yourself without apology. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just about family drama. They're about self-respect, quiet strength, and learning how to walk away from people who only feel powerful when you feel small.